Good evening, friends, and welcome to this very special summit here at the Granite Bay Hilltop Church. We want to welcome all of you to our Creation or Evolution Summit. We have a number of excellent speakers. We are so glad to see you here this evening. But before we get started, we need to tell you about our free offer. It's a recent book published by Pastor Doug entitled 14 Reasons Why Evolution Denies Logic. It's a long title, but a good one. 14 Reasons Why Evolution Denies Logic. If you'd like to receive that, this is also for our friends who are watching, those of you who are here, you can just simply text the code Creation777 to the number 40544. And you probably see the QR code up on your screen. You can scan the QR code, and you'll be able to get this new book, 14 Reasons Why Evolution Defies Logic. Read it and then share it with somebody else. You will be blessed. Again, we want to welcome you. We want to greet those who are joining us across the country and around the world, part of our extended summit audience for this very important study time together. Now, we've got this evening, we're going to have two presentations this evening, and then all day tomorrow we're going to have presentations. The final presentation, which is going to be between 5 and 6 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow afternoon, is going to be a Q&A session. So if you have a Bible question or question related to creation or evolution and you want to get some good input from our speakers, all you have to do is scan the QR code that you see on the screen right now. This is for those of you who are here as well as those who are watching. You can post your question right there. It'll just pop up. You don't have to put in a username or password. It's very easy. Just scan the code. You can type in your question. You'll also be able to read all the other questions that people have posted, and we're going to try to answer as many of these questions tomorrow afternoon. So I'll mention it again tomorrow morning. After tonight's presentation, the next presentation is going to be at 10 o'clock. That's Pacific time tomorrow morning. Now, we have a theme song that we're going to be singing for this summit weekend, and we're going to invite you to stand as we sing, and Jackie on the piano and Pablo is going to lead us in Let All Things Now Living. Let's sing together.
Friends, we're going to ask for God's blessing as we begin this special summit weekend. Loving Lord, we want to thank you for your presence. We want to thank you for this place that's been dedicated to glorify you, to lift up the truth. We pray the truth will be proclaimed this whole weekend and everyone will be edified and liberated and encouraged. Bless the presentations and the speakers. We ask in Christ's name. Amen. You may be seated, friends. Welcome to the Granite Bay Hilltop Church. And I want to welcome our friends who are watching on AFTV or YouTube or Facebook or one of the other venues that are carrying this broadcast. And we know some will be watching and sharing it for years to come. we have brought together a wonderful group of speakers that will be presenting this weekend, talking about, in a very open, honest way, most important issues. You got to know something about where you've come from, what you're doing here, and where you're going in order to have happiness in life. We're going to be talking about the origins and the big questions. My name is Doug Batchelor. I'm the senior pastor here at the Granite Bay Hilltop Church, and also direct the Amazing Facts Ministry, which is next door. We have a symbiotic relationship, there's an evolution word, working together. And I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for tonight. Our first presentation is a dear and an old friend. Cliff Goldstein has been involved in teaching and editing, I should say, both teaching and editing, the Sabbath School Quarterly for the Seventh-day Adventist denomination for 26 years now. And that's a lot of editing, a lot of theology. You may have watched and seen him on Hope Channel or AFTV or some of the other networks. He's written about 26 books. And Cliff and I are dear friends. A quick story, he may share it if I don't first. We both come from atheistic, Jewish, agnostic backgrounds. New York City, Miami Beach, Florida. Talking once about 15 years ago, we found out we were in the same school together in Miami Beach at the same time. And he became the editor for the International Sabbath School Quarterly, and I was teaching it back then internationally. So God's got a sense of humor, right? These two atheist kids that are getting into trouble, and Jews become Christians, and look what happens. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker tonight, Cliff Goldstein, if you'll join me in welcoming him. Cliff, come on out. Thank you.
Yeah, Doug and I were in the same junior high together. He wore his hair differently back then, so I didn't recognize him. I want to ask you a question, and I don't need you to raise your hand, but I want to ask you here, how many of you believe in the biblical creation account? 6 literal days, Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, no sin, no death, the fall with the serpent, the whole spiel. How many of you believe that? Now, if you do believe this, what I want to talk to you about are the implications of what it means if you believe that. If you are a biblical creation, if you creationist, if you reject the idea of theistic evolution or this thing they got now, progressive creationism, or it's just this theistic evolution light, or just that, any of that, if you reject that, do you realize what you're saying? Because, see, I always challenge my theistic evolutionary friends. I say, I want you to think through the implications of what you believe. And tomorrow, I'm going to look at that. But I want you, if you believe in the creation account, I want you to realize the implications of that. If you believe in the biblical creation account, basically what you are saying is that you believe that the thousands and thousands and maybe tens of thousands of some of the world's smartest people, some of the world's most educated people, the PhDs, the postdocs, the Nobel laureates, the experts in these major fields of biology, genetics, chemistry, paleontology, zoology, biochemistry, the whole spiel. By your profession of faith, in believing in the creation account, you're saying that not only do you believe these very smart people, these very educated people, these experts, you're saying that not only are they wrong, you believe that they are radically, radically, radically wrong about origins. Okay, are you prepared? Are you prepared in the face of all that to say that? Now, I remember when I first became a believer, I was totally secular, and then boom, I mean, overnight, my whole worldview changed. I mean, I'm talking about changing at the levels of zeros and ones. Almost everything I believed my whole life, overnight I realized was wrong. And I wrestled with the evolution thing for a while, and then I stopped believing in evolution. But for a long time, it still bothered me. There was this thing in the back of my head that bothered me about all the science, all the experts saying it. It bothered me for a while. But I could say it doesn't bother me at all now. It means nothing to me. If you could change the epistemic architecture of the cosmos, and there were only two possible options for creation. One was Richard Dawkins' flying spaghetti monster. That's what Dawkins' way of mocking Yahweh. If it was either Dawkins' flying spaghetti monster or what thousands and thousands of the world's experts teach, if it had to be one or the other, I'm not kidding you, I would go with Dawkins' flying spaghetti monster first. That's how sure I am that the science is all wrong. Now, this leads to a crucial question for us, though, as believers. How then are we supposed to relate to science? You know, especially when the overarching scientific narrative, which comes, we're told, with overwhelming scientific evidence that 4.3 billion years ago, life started by chance through the same processes of chemistry and physics that exist today, and then through long ages of macroevolution, life evolved. How can we logically and rationally, this is something that is utterly, utterly incompatible with what we believe. And so how can we logically and rationally take that position, particularly when all around us we see the marvels of science? We see the technological marvels. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when telephones were the sizes of toasters. And I remember the good old days of maps. Remember those big fold maps in cars and trying to use them? And I used to take them and just crumple them up and throw them on the floor, trying to fold them back together. We can remember those things. And then, I can still remember in high school lugging around these big 8-track players listening to Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin. You can remember that. And I remember a few years ago at the GC, I was walking through the halls and I heard somewhere on the radio where there was an app that if you're in a store and you heard music, you put the phone up to it, and it would tell you the song. I remember when I heard that, I thought it was magic. It was the most incredible thing. I couldn't believe it. Now it's like indoor plumbing. Let me read you a quote that I just read this quote from Frenchman Marcel Proust. He talked about the telephone. He said was a supernatural instant before whose miracles we used to stand amazed, and which now we employ without giving it a thought to summon our tailor or to order an ice cream. Proust died, by the way, in 1922. Okay, so again, all this, and again, I say this, so we have all this technology from science. And yet when I'm saying some of the science stuff, aren't I being a little disingenuous? To sit there and marvel at what science has given us, the technology, the undeniable, amazing technology that we get from science, and then yet at the same time, I could sit there and utterly reject out of hand this whole area of science. Isn't that, is there a contradiction here? And I'm going to try to show you that there's not. And it comes down to the very nature of science. And I just want to try to help clear up in some people's minds, because we live in a culture where, well, but it's science. And the moment somebody says it's science, we're supposed to kowtow and bow down before it as if science was somehow the ultimate epistemic arbiter of truth. And on one level, it makes a lot of sense because we see how well the science works. But let's look at this a little more closely. I don't know, have any of you ever see the movie Apollo 13? Ron Howard really went out of his way to follow what happened. And there's this great scene where Gene Kranz, played by Ed Harris in a crew cut, Gene Kranz was the head of flight operations. The spacecraft has an explosion 200,000 miles from Earth. And there's this great scene where he stands there in front of a blackboard or a whiteboard, and he's drew a picture of the Earth and a picture of the moon and an X where the spacecraft was. And he said they were going to slit the capsule, go around the moon, and use the moon's gravity to slingshot the capsule back to the Earth. And guess what? It worked. It worked perfectly, even though it was based on science that was there. It was based on science there before the Wright brothers flew. It was based on science before doctors knew even to wash their hands. The science was specifically physics, and it was Isaac Newton in 1687 who formulated the laws of gravity that they used to bring the capsule back. I think if they could have gotten Newton, NASA gotten him, put him in a room, given him a few variables, Newton could have told him what to do. Now, for many people, and at one level, not unreasonably, it's not unreasonable, they believe that things like that Newton did with his science, this proves why science is the best way to attain knowledge. Or some would say the only real way. A famous philosopher in the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, he once said, "What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know." Now that's a bit over the top, but look at how well, look at something like what Newton did. What a powerful example. And NASA used it of the power of science and why many people believe science is, if not the only way, then certain the best way to know truth. And they use this as an example. However, it has nothing to do with that. First of all, Newton, he had no idea what gravity was. When they asked him, he had this famous line in Latin, hypotheus non fingo, or something. I feign no hypotheses. He had no idea how things could attract. In fact, here's what Newton said. He said, the idea that of gravity acting across empty space is so great an absurdity that I believe no man who has in philosophical matters a competent facility of thinking could ever fall into it. This is Newton talking about his own theory. Secondly, Newton built his theory of gravity on the assumption of of absolute time and absolute space, that space and time are the same everywhere. Nobody believes that anymore. And third, a couple hundred years later, Newton's whole theory was overturned. Albert Einstein came and uprooted the whole theory and showed that Newton was wrong. Okay, so this is deemed finding truth. I mean, Newton had no idea how gravity worked. He built his whole theory on false premises, and the theory was overturned and shown false anyway. And this is called finding truth. This is how we discover truth. What this gets to is not just the nature of science, but it's the nature of epistemology, how we know what we know. And it gets into the very question of whether something is fruitful and whether it is true. These are two separate things, and I want to look at it because we're bombarded with the mantra of the overwhelming scientific evidence for billions of years of evolution. But again, I ask you the question, how could we, in the face of all this scientific success, smartphones, spaceships, quantum computers, how can we be so brazen in denying what science says about our origins? Let me read you a quote from a physicist. The most common misunderstanding about science, said physicist Neil Gershenfeld, is that scientists seek and find truth. They don't. They make and test models. What? They don't seek truth? I thought that's what science was all about, seeking truth. In fact, one of the last century's most famous philosophers of science, Bos C. von Frossen, said, quote, "Theories need not be true to be good." What do you mean? What do you mean? Not good to, they don't need to be true to be good? What good is a false theory? What good is a theory that's not true? Well, we just looked at one. Newton's theory was wrong on every level, and yet it worked and it got the space capsule back. Can you see what I'm saying here? Okay, let me give you another example. For centuries in antiquity, using the best science that they had, now science is really a 19th century term. If you wanted to guide your ship for 1,000 years, if you wanted to guide your ship from Genoa to Lisbon, Portugal, or from Rome to Athens, using the stars, you could do it. The science worked. Or if you wanted to predict the motions of Venus in the sky, you could do it using the science. It worked. You could make accurate predictions. Okay? It worked, even though at every single level, the science behind it was wrong. For 1,500 years, people believed that the earth sat immobile. Wrong. They believed it sat immobile at the center of the universe. Wrong. They believed all the sun and the stars and the planets orbited the earth. Wrong. They believed they orbited the earth in perfect circles. Wrong. And they believed they orbited it in constant speeds. Wrong. The whole theory was, on every level was wrong. And yet for 1,500 years, they were able to make accurate predictions, and it worked. It worked. So I don't know if you could see my point here. I want to use one more example. Our smartphones use quantum physics and general relativity. These are two of some of the most proven theories in science. I mean, the accuracy, what they could do with quantum theory, the accuracy is unbelievable. And general relativity, our GPSs use general relativity, okay? They work beautifully on our phones, okay? And yet, the only problem? Well, I'm going to quote you two scientists to tell you the problem. One is Brian Greene. He's a string theorist, and he writes popular books. He says general relativity and quantum mechanics are the two shining achievements of modern physics, but their equations clash when we attempt to merge them. The clash is the greatest puzzle we face. Stephen Hawking, the famous Stephen Hawking, said, the greatest problem facing physics today is reconciling quantum mechanics and general relativity, the two great conceptual revolutions of the first half of the 20th century. Each is extremely successful in its own domain, but they cannot both be correct as they stand. In other words, they clash. They work beautifully. They work amazingly. But as they understand them, they clash. Okay, but they can't be right. Now, for some people, certain philosophers of science, they don't care. That doesn't matter. For them, science is not a search for truth. In fact, I wrote a book a few years ago called Baptizing the Devil: Evolution and the Seduction of Christianity. And I gave it to a scientist friend of mine to read. I said, you find anything in here wrong, mark it. And he made these big round circles all through the book, because he said, any honest scientist will tell you science is not a search for truth. Okay? It's for making models. Now, I don't agree. That is just one view of science, but there are a philosophy of science that say, look, forget about finding truth. All we need to do is make models, make predictions, and make technology. That's all we could get out of science. I mean, look, we all know the famous formula. Everybody knows E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. What does it explain? It explains absolutely nothing. It just describes what happens, but it explains nothing at all. It just pictures it, okay? Let me give you another example. This is a little silly one, but it leads to the problem here, okay? I have my theory X. I don't care what the theory is. My theory is X. And according to my theory X, Y is going to happen. Okay, so I'm a scientist. I'm going to do an experiment. And I do my experiment X. And what do you know? Y happens. And I do it again, and Y happens. And then they have a thing in science called replication. And so other scientists do everything they do following theory X, and every single time they do X, Y happens. All over the world, they all do it. So what is the logical conclusion to draw about your theory X and Y happening? Well, the logical conclusion, most people say, it's true. It's obviously true, right? Every single time you do the experiment, X, Y happens. So you think it's true. It has absolutely nothing to do with it being true. And let me give you an example, okay? I have my theory X. My theory X is that invisible spiders from Mars come down to earth and push things to the ground. Okay? That's my theory X, okay? All right, I'm going to test my theory X. Okay? If according to my theory X, this should fall to the ground. I just got scientific confirmation for my theory X. Okay, now that might seem like a silly example, but it's a fundamental problem. They call it in science the fallacy of affirming the consequent or underdetermination of theory by evidence. But the point is, no matter what theory you have, no matter how well it works, it could always be overturned or replaced by something else. The fact that you can make accurate predictions or create wonderful technology is great, it's wonderful. But in many cases, it's totally irrelevant to whether the theory is true or not. It's fascinating if you could study and look at the theories that people believed were absolutely true a century ago. Scientific theories, overwhelming confirmation that today sound more like mythology than science at all. Okay, so my theory here, and now this might be a silly example, but it brings to the point that saying a theory works and saying it works is a radically different thing than saying the theory behind it is true. It's a total separate issue, but it's very important to remember because, again, we're dealing with the context that we're told that the overwhelming evidence, science shows 3.7 billion years ago or whatever, simple life started. And folks, this is not just a model for them. This is what they believe is the truth. This is how they interpret all the evidence, everything. They interpret it through this model. And again, if it's true, our whole faith is a lie. And I'm going to bring that out tomorrow. I'm going to look at that a little more. Okay, but now this leads to a question. This leads to a difficult question. And that question is, how come science, which apparently gets so many things right, and by right, I mean not finding truth, but they just get things that work. Our cell phones, quantum computers, there's something going on. I don't believe it's all wrong. In some ways, I think there's something there to it. And they make this incredible technology. But why have they, and from our perspective, gotten origins so wrong? What happens? Why would something like that happen? Well, I think science works on two foundational principles. Principles that when I believe them, when I say them, I think you're going to believe them. Okay? These are logical, rational, and very sensible principles that science could not work on without these principles, okay? The first principle is the idea that science, which studies the natural world, the physical world, must look only to the natural, to the physical world for answers. Natural effects have natural causes, okay? I tore my meniscus 2 weeks ago. Okay, the thing is killing me. I hope you appreciate me schlepping out here on this thing because it hurts, okay? Now, I am going to break down and I'll probably go to the doctor. And my doctor's an Adventist, and I'm going to want him to pray with me, but I got a physical problem here. So I'm going to want a physical answer to it. I'm going to want whether, hydrotherapy or surgery or whatever. I'm hoping it'll just go away on its own. But 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 even then, it would be something physical, the body healing. Okay? So you want a physical effect, physical cause and physical effects. This is how science works. You've got natural causes, you want natural effects for the causes, okay? Saying the angel Gabriel did it and so on, that's not going to work in science. It shouldn't work in science. That's one. And it's reasonable enough. It's very reasonable on the surface. The second principle is just as reasonable, and science couldn't function without this either. And it's that the laws of nature remain constant. Okay, the laws have to remain constant. All things being equal, and the fact is all things are never equal, but all that being said, all things being equal, a physical law, a natural law does today what it did yesterday and what it'll do tomorrow. Okay? There's not, outside of other physical factors, that holds true. I mean, for example, whatever the laws of aerodynamics were, when they built the jet plane I flew out on here, maybe they built, it was an Airbus, I think. I think the French built it. Okay, maybe they built it 20 years ago. I'm going to assume the laws of aerodynamics 20 years ago in France are the same as the laws of aerodynamics now today. Okay, we couldn't function, and you certainly couldn't do science if that wasn't true. Okay, so on one level, it makes absolute perfect sense. We have two principles. The first principle, natural effects from natural causes, and the principles of the constancy of nature. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah, of course. They're wonderful. It makes sense. But you know what? When it comes to origins, they both are false. Okay? I'll show you what I mean, okay? Let's go to the first one. Only natural causes for natural effects? Have you ever read the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis? Okay, it's supernatural from beginning to end, okay? Everything about it, God speaks and this happens, God speaks and this, I mean, the whole thing from beginning to end is supernatural. Everything about it is supernatural, okay? God said, let the land prove vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and God said, and it was so. I mean, speaking something into existence. The whole thing from beginning to end. This is so supernatural. This is so far beyond any explanation. Now, but it's like, let me look at it this way. Let's say, and I'll pick on somebody here. Let's say this lady right here. Let's say you murdered somebody, okay? And the police come, and the police automatically, I'm going to rule this woman out as the killer. She could not have done it, okay? Then, by default, whomever they arrest is what? They got the wrong person, okay? So if you've got a creation that is supernatural from beginning to end, and yet science comes along and absolutely a priori out of the gate denies the supernatural, then whatever you're going to get by default has to be wrong. And so we got this sheer nonsense of billions of years of evolution. I mean, come on. The veil gets torn from your eyes. And when you see it, it's so utterly, utterly, utterly ridiculous. And yet it's the dominant, every book I read, everything I read, if there's anything, it just assumes evolution. And the second thing is the constancy of nature. Well, in principle, that sounds nice. Okay? But let's just think for a minute. Let me read you a Bible text. Let me read you Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death came to all people. I mean, come on, what is this saying? It's proposing an environment. It's proposing a world as radically different from ours as you could possibly imagine. You see my point here? We live in an environment where everything alive dies. Death dominates almost everything. I mean, can you imagine? Oh, I can't even conceive of a world without death. Okay, we're dealing with such a radically different environment. And look, we all know this famous quote, I marvel at what we've been given with this gift, spirit of prophecy. Listen to this quote. This is in Patriarchs and Prophets, talking about Adam and Eve. As they witnessed in drooping flower and falling leaf the first signs of decay, Adam and his companion mourned more deeply than men now mourn over their dead. The death of the frail, delicate flowers was indeed a cause of sorrow. But when the goodly trees cast off their leaves, the scene brought vividly to mind the stern fact that death is the portion of every living thing. So again, what I'm just trying to say, what can science, which studies only an environment where everything dies, where it's assumed death was how everything came here. I'm going to look at that tomorrow. In their theory, death is what created everything. But how could they, which study an environment which death occurs everywhere, understand an environment where there was not death to begin with? So can you see the point here? It's no wonder science gets creation wrong. It denies right out the gate two foundational aspects of creation. The supernatural, no, you can't use, and it's really sad too. I just finished this great book called Some New World by Peter Harrison. And this guy talked about the fact that the whole scientific revolution began. Everybody knew God created the world. And science began as an attempt, let's try to understand better how God created the world. And now that they've thrown it out in this whole idea of, simply, I talk sometimes about simple cells. Well, everybody now knows there's, simple cells. I got to say, I'm going to write a column. I thought about it coming out. I'm going to call it the hydrogen atom. Okay? The simplest atom is a hydrogen atom. The nucleus is one proton and an electron cloud. That's all it is. It's number one. It's the first thing on the periodic element. A simple hydrogen atom. But if you study what goes into it, the proton is made of two up quarks and a down quark, and the strong color force, the math trying to describe this, and then the electromagnetism that holds the electron cloud over it. Very complicated math. And then when then the cloud is there, and then you bring it, you look at it, and then the electron cloud collapses, and it follows what's called the Schrodinger wave equation. In other words, it's just a cloud until you look at it. And then when you look at it, if the cloud collapses into following a thing called the Schrodinger wave equation. But anyway, look, the Forget about it. The point is, I'm just saying that a simple hydrogen atom, it screams at the fine-tune, the balance there. It screams at design and a designer. And yet we're supposed to believe, because science, overwhelming evidence, that it's all just by chance. It's ridiculous. But again, they've ruled out what really happened. Okay, and then the radical discontinuity between what the world was like when God created it and what it's now. But they reject that. And so they look at everything now and they say that's the way it always has been. And yet science doesn't just miss the mark, it goes disastrously off the mark, because it just works from two false assumptions. And yet the sad thing about it is there's so many, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow too. There's so many Christians. It's just typical Christian history. Whatever the culture is, they're Christians being led around by the nose culture. And we've got science telling us billions of years of evolution. And so only us hayseed, Bible-thumping Christians, whatever, who are not going to follow fundamentalists, are not going to follow it. And look, this isn't anything new. A very famous and very influential theologian, he railed against creationists like us. Well, maybe not, it's a different context, but he railed against Christians, he said, who expressed, quote, utterly foolish and obviously untrue statements about the creation, because these untrue statements make Christians look bad when the overwhelming evidence is everybody knows that this stuff. And that's what a lot of them will say about creation. It's, well, we've got all this scientific evolution, okay? All this scientific stuff proving evolution. And when people talk about, Adam and Eve and all that, they make us look bad. That's what they say. Now, who was this Christian? It was Augustine of Hippo, okay, who lived, he died 430 AD. So what does that mean? That means if some Christian at that time said that the earth, that the sun, not the earth, sat at the center of the galaxy or the solar system, they would have been mocked and derided and hounded. Well, everybody knows the earth sits at the center. And everybody knows that the planet, just look, it sure looks, you look up in the sky, it's obvious the sun is orbiting it and the planets are orbiting it. Everybody knew that. And I imagine he would deride anybody. These were the kind of what we would call these obviously foolish statements that Augustine railed against. Because again, everybody knew the earth sat immobile at the center of the universe, and the stars and all the planets orbited it. And they knew it for more than 1,000 years. And to say anything else different would be like somebody's a flat earther or something, okay? So the bottom line, let me just wrap this up. The clock is ticking here. The bottom line here is, look, we're dazzled. We're dazzled, and rightly so, by what science can do. It's just, I'm amazed. I read a lot of science stuff. I'm amazed, particularly physicists. Physics to me are like the high priests of the secular world. It's just, the physics is unbelievable to me what they can do. We are dazzled, and the fact that the stuff works, but the fact that a theory works, the fact that you can make accurate predictions or even create great technology is a total separate issue from the fact about whether the theory is true or not. It does not make it the truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The truth is that Jesus, our Creator and Redeemer, and there are few intellectual ideas in history, and I'm going to look at this tomorrow, that are more antithetical, more anti-biblical, anti-gospel, anti-everything we believe than this idea of billions of years of evolution, even though it comes to us under the name of science. Okay, let's pray. Okay. Father, I thank you for just the marvels of the created world, the marvels of nature. And I just look around and I just see evidence of your creative power everywhere. In fact, I could say that your existence and the existence of you as a God of love is the most obvious truth I know. And there's so many forces working against it. And help us not to be fooled by things just because they come in the name of science. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Cliff. We're going to take just a short break as we get set up for the next presentation, which is Dr. Walter Veith. We are so glad that Jackie Jewell is with us again here this weekend. She's going to be bringing us some wonderful music. For our friends who are watching, don't go too far, about 8 minutes or so, and we're going to start our second presentation. God bless. Hello friends, we want to welcome you back to part 2 of the summit entitled Creation or Evolution. We want to welcome those who are here in person, and again we want to invite you to come down and take your seat. We'd also like to welcome those who are joining us once again across the country and around the world. We've got a wonderful weekend in store. If you're just joining us, I want to remind you of our free gift this evening. It is a book written by Pastor Doug, and it's entitled 14 Reasons Why Evolution Defies Logic. And this is our free gift. So if you'd like to receive it, all you need to do is text the word Creation 777 to the number 40544, and you'll be able to receive a digital download of the book. Again, that's Creation 777 to the number 40544. Now, as I mentioned a little earlier, this is our opening in our weekend on Creation Evolution Summit. This program, this event continues tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock Pacific time. So we want to remind you about that. We have a full day, and those of you who are joining us, we start live tomorrow morning with Pastor Doug at 10 a.m. Our speaker this evening for our second presentation is Professor Walter Veith. Now, I'm from South Africa. Professor Walter Veith is from South Africa. I was a student at the time, and I remember hearing rumors that began to spread around about a professor from a very prestigious university in South Africa who was an evolutionist, but he had become a creationist, and it had caused quite a stir, as you can imagine, at the university, and that's how I was introduced to Dr. Veith. Well, of course, we've heard many presentations, and I think you have too, but if you are new this evening, if you've never heard of Professor Walter Veith, let me give you a little background information. Professor Walter Veith is a zoologist, he's an author, he's a speaker, known for his work in nutrition, creationism, and biblical exegesis. He obtained his Bachelor of Science and his Master of Science degrees in zoology from the University of Stellenbosch, followed by his PhD in zoology from the University of Cape Town. His academic career includes serving as professor as well as chair of the Department of Zoology at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. In the 1980s, following a series of personal experiences, and he might share a little bit about that, and in-depth studies, Dr. Veith transitioned from atheism to Christianity, eventually becoming a Bible-believing Christian. Following his conversion, he began lecturing internationally on topics including creation science, Bible prophecy, health, Christian living, and more. Dr. Veith has authored several books, most notably The Creation Conflict, which challenges evolutionary theory and presents evidence supporting creationism. His ministry, The Clash of Minds, and his Q&A program called What's Up, Prof, is popular with audiences around the world. His presentation this evening is entitled 10 Questions Regarding Evolution. Let's give Dr. Walter Veith a warm welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I'm here to bore you for the next 50 minutes. I heard tonight that Pastor Doug and our previous speaker were both atheists, and as you probably know, some of you, I was also an atheist. But I had a twist. They came from a Jewish background. I came from a sort of Christian background. But my twist was that I wasn't only an atheist, I was also a God hater. I hated God with every fiber of my being. Not because the God of the Bible is the problem, but the theology that is presented in the world out there paints a very distorted picture of God. And it is quite possible that when you are confronted with some of these pictures and the animosity that seems to emanate from God, that you can start to hate him. And so being an atheist and a God hater was quite an interesting combination. And when I was a lecturer at Stellenbosch University, and I did get my PhD from Cape Town University, but I was not the chair of zoology there. I was the chair of zoology at Western Cape University for about 15 years. Now, when I became a Christian, my life really changed. It became a nightmare. I'm hoping to wake up at some stage and realize that it was just a nightmare. But it is a radical change that has to take place when you switch from one philosophy to another philosophy, and my emphasis is on the word philosophy, because science and the science of origins are two totally different things. Science is empirical investigation based on experimentation. And yes, you have hypotheses, as we heard before, but the philosophy of origins is a totally different thing. Now, in our country, where I come from, people are generally very religious, and they believe in God. But when they come to the university, they are confronted with a totally new philosophy. And in fact, we have Christian organizations that are present at the universities that train students in the science of evolution so that they do not make fools of themselves as Christians later on. So in other words, they are literally, proselytized into believing the theory of evolution. We were never afraid of creationists. We loved them when they came around so that we could rip them apart and laugh at what they were saying. You see, the science that they brought was not necessarily wrong, because I believe a lot of that science today. But it had to be ridiculed purely from the basis that it had to be wrong. Why? Because there was no God. And if there is no God, whatever theory you come up with on origins, it has to be wrong, because it has to be naturalistic. There is no God. And so when a theory runs into trouble, then you have to find solutions for that trouble, and you have to change your approach, but the basic premise is there is no God. And if he were there, you'd hate him anyway. And so I was often confronted in my lectures, because I used to lecture on evolution. I was a committed evolutionist with young students that would say, "Excuse me, I believe that God created this world." They would never get any further than that sentence, because you would destroy them, ridicule them. And I've had students burst into tears, and I'd feel pretty good about myself, having destroyed their little childish philosophies about some deity out there. Can you imagine a world like that? Many of you probably can't. Well, when I changed my view, I had to find a new foundation. Where was I going to get that foundation? I didn't have the facts at my fingertips as I would perhaps have them today. And so I was confronted with the situation where I had to present a class, and I could either stand there and pretend that no change had taken place in my mind, or I could face my fears and my colleagues and ask a few questions. And that's what I did. I asked questions. I didn't actually present any answers to those questions. I just asked questions. And to the best of my knowledge, I had 10 questions. Now, this was some 38 years ago, so I'm not absolutely sure whether these questions were the ones that I asked, but the essence was more or less what I will be talking about today. 10 questions that I presented, and the result was pandemonium. Pandemonium. I never even supplied any answers to those questions, but the result was pandemonium. Not only pandemonium, but vicious anger, such as I had seldom seen in my entire life. And the consequence was that a young girl got up after those 10 questions and accused the lecturers, saying to them, "When I came to this university, I believed in God, and you have destroyed my faith. And now I can see that you duped me." Now, all my colleagues were basically atheists, but some of them actually went to church and were elders in churches, but they were atheists. I don't quite know how that works, but Richard Dawkins recently in an interview said that he is an atheist, but he considers himself a cultural Christian. Because the alternative, the other religious views out there, were, in his opinion, worse. But when you read his book, that he writes about his view on God, the God delusion, he actually points out that he hates God. And the strange thing is, he hates God for the same reasons that I hated him. This vindictive deity that shoves you into hell and roasts you for all eternity on the basis of a short life, which in terms of eternity is non-existence, was rather cruel. And this was the reason why he rejected it, same as I did. So let me run through these questions before they kick me off the stage. In Exodus chapter 20 we read, "In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Now you tell an atheist that he must rest on the seventh day because God created the world in 6 days. Do you think that'll go down well? Is it even logical? Why would you want to keep one day in commemoration of creation if there was no 6-day creation? That wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. That's sort of a disconcordance in your mind. And try and get your head around that one. But that is exactly what the Bible says. Now, can something like that be true in the face of all the science out there? Well, I posted these 10 questions. Let me run through them for you. If the evolution of life started with low diversity, and diversity increased over time, why does the fossil record show higher diversity in the past and lower diversity as time progressed? It's a simple question. And it's a known scientific fact that if you go back into the paleontological record, there are far more creatures out there than we have today. So we seem to be losing species at an incredible rate. And that loss is continuing to this very day. As we speak, species are going extinct on this planet. And yet you have to ask yourself the question, how is it possible that it had to start with low diversity, but when you go to the paleontological record, you see the opposite. You see zillions getting less and less as we go along. It's the reverse. So that's the first question. The second question I posed was, if evolution of necessity should progress from small creatures to large creatures over time, why does the fossil record show the reverse? It's just a question. I mean, it's logical, right? You don't start evolution with an elephant jumping out of a pool. It doesn't happen that way. You start off with a unicellular creature. It must be small in the beginning, and then it must increase in size. But if you go to the paleontological record, everything was bigger and bigger and larger and more wonderful. They must have all come from the United States of America. Than they are today. So what happened? So let me show you some size comparisons. This is an artist's view, but it's pretty accurate. And it appeared in a scientific publication, so let me show it to you. There on the left, you have the sloth, the ancient giant sloth. And clinging to its side over there is the modern equivalent. Would you agree that that is quite a reduction in size? I think so. Now, obviously, this creature lived millions of years ago, until in South America, in a cave, they found intact pelts. In other words, the skin of the creature intact with that size. So that put the cat amongst the pigeons. Or what about the wombat there on the right, with its modern equivalent at the bottom there? That's quite a reduction in size. Is this evolution or is this devolution? Are we going forward or are we going backward? Or the lion, or the orangutan, the size difference between the fossil and the present one is pretty dramatic. Or the capybara on the left there, or the armadillo on the right. The big one is the fossil that you find, and the other one is the modern day equivalent. Or the horse, or the shark. If you want to really see how big those sharks were, look at that picture on the right, and on the left there is one tooth. That's pretty big. They would use a modern great white as a toothpick. So what has happened? Was it a weird and wonderful world that existed in the past? Did something strange happen and, it just deteriorated to what it is today, or the bison or the crocodile or any one of those? The third question, and this gets a little bit philosophical, natural selection works by the elimination of the weaker variants. So how does a mechanism that works by subtraction create more diversity? That's a simple question. Let me try and unpack that a little bit for you, and we'll unpack it more tomorrow. But this is the heart, the driving force of the evolutionary theory. So you have these variants, and then over time, through natural selection, one is favored over the other. We call him the fitter, and the other one the less fit, and eventually the fitter one replaces the other one. So you started off with 2 variants or 3, and you end up with fewer variants. So the question is, how does this mechanism that makes less and less over time manage to create more and more diversity as we go along? Isn't that a logical question? Okay. So how would we consider Darwin's finches, for example, and all those variants that evolved over time? We know they exist today, so what happened? We'll go to that tomorrow. The fourth question is, why do the great phyla of the biome all appear simultaneously in the fossil record? This is a bomber. And even in the oldest fossil records, namely those with the macrofossils at least, the Cambrian, why are they there all of a sudden? Now, I don't know whether you are familiar with what a phylum is. Are you? Anybody not know what a phylum is? A phylum is the largest category of similar creatures that exist. So the animal kingdom is divided up into phyla. So we belong to the phylum Chordata. That's anything with a backbone type structure, whether it is made of bone or of cartilage or of fibers, doesn't matter, as long as it has a rigid sort of rod in the back, and I have one here. You belong to the chordates. And then you get the arthropods. They have a skeleton on the outside. Anything that has that, whether it's an insect or a crab or whatever, it belongs to that phylum. It's huge categories of creatures. Now the question is, how can these phyla appear simultaneously? Because logically, in the evolutionary process, one form evolves into another over very long periods of time, and they should be appearing sequentially in the fossil record. It's impossible to imagine that they can all appear at the same time. So whether you're talking about insects or crustaceans or annelids or mollusks or roundworms, let's take the phylum Mollusca. Anything from a squid to an octopus to a snail to a slug to a marine-footed creature, they all belong to that. It's a huge category of animals. And that, plus all of these others, appear suddenly and simultaneously. They call it the Cambrian explosion. And if you go to a document like Scientific American, for example, they talk about the phyla appeared almost simultaneously. They're lying because they put the word almost in there. Because they don't appear almost simultaneously, they appear simultaneously. That's mind-boggling. How could this have happened? And so they comment that fast turns out to be much faster than anyone ever thought. It's almost like somebody said, let it be, and there it was. And then they have this document over here where they claim that older textbooks proclaim that our phylum, that we belong to, the chordates, must have appeared very late in the evolutionary process. But oh, troublesome, troublesome science. They're there in the Cambrian explosion. In other words, they were there from the beginning. Now that must radically change your thinking. You must rethink your entire science. But there's no God. So you leave him out of the equation. You have to find a solution to this problem. And then you have another problem, that is there are no intermediary fossils. So how do you deal with it? So the fifth question was the following. Why do we have to postulate punctuated equilibrium to explain away the lack of intermediary fossils when gradualism used to be the only plausible explanation for the evolutionary fossil record? Did you all get that question? Well, you know, my colleagues, they varied in age. And the older colleagues were all, well, we were all Darwinists, because we were evolutionists, but the older colleagues were gradualists. Now, that's a nice word, gradualists. What does that mean? That means you believe that life evolved over long periods of time and gradually changes took place so that one form gave rise to another. That makes sense? That's Darwinism at its very basic core. Gradualism. And it's the only logical way to conceive of an evolutionary process. The only logical one. But unfortunately, that would imply that if gradual change took place, you should find the gradual intermediaries. Doesn't that make sense? I mean, something that looks like a cow that evolves into something that looks like a whale must have something in between, right? What if it's not there? Well, then you have to rethink gradualism. And so Stephen Jay Gould came up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium. It's a beautiful term, which means the following. Long periods of no change, no gradualism, equilibrium, and then punctuated, rapid change. So rapid that there's no record of it in the fossil record. That's a fact. Now, the younger colleagues at my university, we were all punctuated equilibriumists. The older ones were clinging to the hope that they would find those fossils. So they were gradualists. So we had a lot of arguments back and forth, who's right, punctuated equilibriumists following Stephen Jay Gould, or old-fashioned Darwinists, who's right? But the basic premise was always, somewhere there must be an answer because there is no God. Did you get that? All right, so we have to postulate punctuated equilibrium. In other words, the mere fact that modern evolutionists by nature are punctuated equilibrianists is an admittance that gradualism cannot be right. Because then you would have to find the intermediaries. Why would you have to change your a priori assumptions in order to accommodate the theory? Because the facts don't match the theory. Good. That caused quite an interesting debate. Can you imagine that? The sixth one. If natural selection works at the level of the phenotype and not the level of the genotype, then how did the genes, mitosis, meiosis, with all their intricate and highly accurate mechanisms of gene transfer evolve? Did you get that one? All right, let me unpack it for you. Natural selection doesn't read your genes. It couldn't care less about your genes. Natural selection only cares about what you look like. Are you a giraffe with a long neck, or are you a giraffe with a short neck? I don't know why a short neck shouldn't work as well, because there's lots of things to eat down there anyway, but don't worry about that. The fact of the matter is, natural selection only cares about what is physically there. All right, two people are running. One has got very short legs, another one's got very long legs. Who do you put your money on if you take a bet? Because who's going to win? The long-legged one, right? That's his appearance. That's what he looks like. And that we call his phenotype. His phenotype is what we actually see. So if I describe any one of you, I would be describing your phenotype. I would not be unraveling your genes and telling you what your DNA composition is like in order for you to look like what you are looking like. Natural selection doesn't read. It can't read your genes. It can just read the result of your genes. Does that make sense to you? All right, so here's the question now. If this is true, that natural selection only works at the level of the phenotype and not the level of the genotype, and there is no Darwinist who won't agree with that fact. It's an axiom. It's logical. Then the question is, how did the intricate genetic makeup and the possibility for cells to divide and still maintain their integrity, how did it come about? How did the genes evolve if natural selection doesn't care about your genes, but only about what the result thereof is you? How did it come about? Or how did meiosis develop? Where you actually halve what you have and share with the other partner and mix it up to make a new variant, which is called your child. How did these things come about? Well, the only logical answer that you have then, because natural selection doesn't work at the level of the genotype, it cannot, is that it had to come about by chance. All right, let me make this a little more simple for you then. So your phenotype is that little man there on the right. That's what you look like. And yes, you are the result of your genotype. But natural selection doesn't know that. So it only worries about the phenotype. So all your genes that code for your phenotype, how did they come into existence? Natural selection had nothing to do with it. Had to come about by chance, random chance. Rewriting and rewriting, you know the old story in the books about how many monkeys need to be typing randomly to get the Encyclopedia Britannica, and all of those ideas that they put out there. Well, eventually they say they will. They never will. They never will. They might get a word, but will they get it in the right sequence? And your DNA molecule is far more complex than we knew when Watson and Crick decoded the DNA molecule. It's far more complicated than that. So how did all of these things come about? And how did these reactions come about? Let me unpack it for you a little more. Your phenotype, in this case, is your aeroplane. And your genotype is the engineer's book on how to construct that aeroplane. Are you with me? So natural selection will want to see whether this phenotype, this aeroplane, is any good. How good is it? But that's not going to work unless you have two aeroplanes. Because selection implies that there's something to choose, right? And I understand that the United States is now building a new fighter jet that is supposed to outstrip the powers of the Chinese jets. Is that correct? I just heard that this project has been given to Boeing. That seems to be struggling because I flew here on an Airbus. So maybe that'll help them. So the natural selection is going to be which one flies best, the USA new prototype that Boeing's going to build, or is it the Chinese model? That's selection. You need two of them. Are you with me? All right. So which one is going to fly best? That was the question. Let's go back to that one. So engineers have been working round the clock, and apparently this prototype, as I've read in the news, has been tested now for some 5 years, and they're ready for production. You probably all know about these things, right? My question is, who wrote the book? Who wrote the book? It's not a stupid question. Some engineer wrote it, right? Or a bunch of engineers wrote it in great detail. But it's genotype, it's a book. All right, I have a book in the front here. I see here's a book. Here's a book. Let's say it's got all the information for that particular aeroplane right here in this book. Everything is here. Everything that scientist and that engineer, in all his ingenuity, in all his years of training, managed to put together, he put into this book. Let's put the book down there and let's wait for the aeroplane to appear. What's funny about that? How long am I going to wait?
Forever.
Are you sure? Yep. But all the information's here. And who wrote it? Well, when it comes to naturalistic science, who wrote it? Who wrote the book? Who wrote the blueprint about what you're all about? Who wrote it? Oh, well, you're a believer, right? There is no God. There's no God. That's ludicrous. That's childish fairy tale. Who wrote the book? Chance wrote the book. Chance wrote the book. There is no other alternative because there is no God. We can't allow a divine foot into science. That would not be naturalistic then anymore. That would be supernatural. There is no God. So whether it works or whether it doesn't work, whether it's probable or whether it's not probable, it doesn't matter. Chance wrote the book. My next question. The process of crossing over during meiosis is an extremely sophisticated mechanism that requires absolute precision. How could natural selection bring this about if it can only operate at the level of a phenotype? I don't know whether you were involved in biology courses. Who studied meiosis here? A couple, all right. Meiosis is an incredibly precise operation. Because in meiosis, you have to halve the number of chromosomes, and you split them into what you got from your father and what you got from your mother. And then you pair them up with your partner's chromosomes. But before you do that, there's a process of crossing over, where certain genetic material that you got from your father is crossed over to the genetic material that you got to from your mother, and vice versa, and it has to be absolutely precise. If you cut that gene that is crossed over in the wrong place, just one little letter further than it should, the whole thing becomes drivel, garbage. And you won't have children, you'll have cabbages or something similar. No mistakes. And yet, through the very process, I can with confidence say to you tonight that if I said to you, will the two that are absolutely identical in every aspect please stand up in this hall? Nobody would get up, because you're all different. That's why by looking at each other, we can give each other names and not get confused, because we're all different, we're all unique. Because we have this tremendous variability that has been built into the process. How did this mechanism come about? And it is so amazing. There may be no mistake. They even give the enzymes that are involved in this activity certain names. So you have transcription enzymes that run along and make an exact copy of whatever there is you are copying. But to make sure that there's no mistake, because you don't want cabbages, you want real children, you have another 5 enzymes running after them that are called editases. That's a nice name, because they edit. Clifford Goldstein is an editor. You should know what that means. It means you go through the script to see if there's something wrong and you fix it, right? And that's what they do. They make sure there's no mistake. That's why humanity can still exist, although we are, believe it or not, greatly deteriorated. Because as we said before, everything was bigger and better and larger and greater and more superb than they are today. So this magnificent process is not subject to natural selection. Only the result thereof, what I see in the offspring, is subject to it. So how did it come about? Can you see the wheels turning in those students, postgraduate students and my colleagues? So there are your chromosomes. 23 pairs, one from your dad, one from your mom. They line up like that, and then they start switching material. Hundreds of thousands of times they cross them over, so that you are a little bit of dad and a little bit of mom and a little bit of mom and a little bit of dad. And the result is whatever it is. And grandma comes and says, "You look just like your father." And the aunt comes and says, "No, no, no, I just see the mother." Isn't that true? Isn't that what happens? How did that come about? It's amazing. And so let's say the blue is dad and the red is mom. And you do that 100,000 times, and you have to do it absolutely accurately, or else nothing works. That is a phenomenal event. Question number 8. How can we explain the evolution of 2 sexes? Now I'm on dangerous ground, because I don't know which pronouns to use now. But fortunately, your president said, no, we only recognize 2, so I'm okay. So how can we explain the evolution of two sexes? With compatible anatomical differences, when only the result of the union, increased diversity in the offspring, is subject to selection, but not the cause. Just think about that for a while. Now that little amoeba, or whatever it was, that first protozoan, only had no sex. There was no partner. And then for millions of years, these protozoans increased and natural selection sorted them out until there were none left. No, I'm sorry. Somehow magically increased the diversity, although it should have reduced the diversity. And here they were, swimming in a soup. And eventually they got stuck together. We'll talk more about that tomorrow and how it all came about. But there weren't two sexes. They didn't exist. Now, two sexes is a very serious issue, because then in order for it to work, you need to have meiosis, right? We just spoke about it. Because if I have 46 chromosomes and there was no meiosis, and my wife had 46 chromosomes, how many chromosomes would my offspring have then? It would become intolerable, right? Become more and more and more. So now we have to keep it at 46. So let's, halve them down to 23 and 23, and then mix it up and all of that good stuff. But the two sexes, how did they come about? What is the aim, according to science, of having two sexes? What is the aim? Why does science postulate that the evolutionary process had to eventually introduce sexes? The answer is to increase diversity. That's the answer. You have to increase diversity, because natural selection does what? Reduces diversity. It works on the basis of subtraction, not on the basis of addition. All right, so how magically did they come about? Boom! One day they were there, like the Cambrian explosion. Wow, is that Eve? Is that how it happened? Because natural selection won't do it. And then, if you haven't noticed, they're anatomically different. I don't know about the bathrooms and the stuff now, let's not go there. But they are anatomically different. Thank God they are. Question, how did it come about? Chance or design? That's the question. I have two more questions for you. Do you realize how much anatomy and physiology and hormonal differences and all of these issues are involved in this process? It's mind-boggling. And to believe that it came about by chance, without natural selection actually being involved, because only the result of the union, the increased diversity in the offspring, can be subject to the selective process. It is mind-boggling. So any modification in the genotype to bring about changes in the phenotype occur by chance through mutation. So all of these things happen by chance through mutation. Now we're going to talk about that some more tomorrow when we talk a little bit more about the genes. Now we only have 50 minutes, so I don't have time to give you the answers. I only have time for the questions. So this whole issue of fertilization, independent assortment, crossing over, these are incredible mechanisms. Can you imagine unraveling a DNA molecule to make a duplicate? Have you ever envisaged a rope that is twined, two pieces entwined and twisted together. And you're going to open them up. So you hold the one end and I'll hold the other end, and let's open them and pull them apart to see what's in the middle. What happens as we start pulling them apart? They get tighter and tighter in the middle, right? Until we can't pull them apart anymore. I'm going to read the genes in the middle. How am I going to do that? Because it's a helix. It goes round and round and round. How am I going to twist them apart? Do you know that there are enzymes that clip onto certain sections like ball bearings and go so you can read the next bit and then go tick, 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 tick. Put them together again in the right sequence so that you don't become a cabbage? Can you imagine that? How intricate the process is? It's mind-boggling. I could give you a lecture of many hours on how that works. It's amazing. And chance did it. The next question, number 9, was the evolution of molecules of life all require totally different environmental conditions to come into existence. Without enzymes, and some have never been produced under any simulated environmental conditions, why do we cling to the explanation for the origin of chemicals of life? Let me make this simple. Moreover, the reactions that have been simulated produce left and right-handed molecules, but life can only use left-handed racemic molecules, and there's no random mechanism that allows for this. So the early atmosphere would have had to be a reducing atmosphere, devoid of oxygen. But if water is essential for evolution of life, then in the absence of ozone, cosmic rays would enter the atmosphere, and they would denature water, and that consists of hydrogen and oxygen, so there would be oxygen. So we have a problem. So Stanley Miller is the one who came up with this experiment, where he put a primitive atmosphere into a chamber, closed system, passed sparks through it, and then isolated certain organic molecules and said, this is how life started, by creating these molecules. And this primitive atmosphere consisted of hydrogen, ammonia, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen, and water. Volcanic gases are not reducing atmospheres because they contain sulfur dioxide, for example. And the present atmosphere has oxygen. That would never work, because as soon as the molecule is created, the radiation destroys it. So you can never get a molecule unless you have a closed system, and there never was a closed system. But there's another problem, the left and the right. So let's say you create amino acid. Some of them have never been created by any experiment. But let's say you create amino acids, and you have left-handed and right-handed ones. If you want to know how that works, then just lift up your hands like this and look at them. They're mirror images of each other, aren't they? So left is where your thumb is on the right, and right is where your thumb is on the left. Correct? Whatever. So these are mirror images, and the same with molecules. They are mirror images. And mirror images have to be selected. The left-handed ones are called L, and the right-handed ones are called D, and you can never put one D into a protein and have a functional protein. It wouldn't work. So naturalistically, you could never get a protein that is conducive for life. How did it come about? How did you do it? And once you want to do the nitrogenous basis of your DNA structure, you need a different atmosphere. And so scientists has grappled with the idea. We don't have to go into the details. We only have 4 minutes to finish this. How did they come about? Well, you need different atmospheres in different situations. Maybe there were different situations on the earth where it could have happened. And then scientists will say, but it couldn't have happened there. It can't. You can't have all these different scenarios to create these molecules naturalistically. So where do they come from? So they come up with the idea called panspermia. Nice name. Which means it came from out there. And it spermed this world. It came from outer space. It can't happen here, it must have happened there. Is that a solution? If it can't happen there, why can it happen out there? Yes, it's not as easy as the textbook seems to imply. Get a couple of molecules. Ooh, this is how it happened. But you can't get the rest of them. It's very complicated. The last question. How do we explain irreducible complexity if the probability of any of these mechanisms come into existence by chance? What is irreducible complexity? It's a term Michael Veith came up with, and it's a very good one. Let me give you an example. Here's a scientific publication. If I had to read it to you, you'd probably go nuts. And so I'm not going to read it to you. On one of these problematic structures, and that is the flagella motor. The flagella motor of a bacterium or of a human sperm cell, for example, has a flagellum. And it has a motor that drives it. So it's this filamental tail and this structure that is inside the cell wall, and it looks roughly in the cell wall like it does there on the right, and these are all protein kinds that work together to make this thing work. And it's a highly complex structure, and it has to be absolutely complete, or else it won't work. So in E. coli, for example, and you have millions of them in your gut right now, they're all swimming around in your gut using this motor. The ones on the left use a proton motor using hydrogen, and some bacteria or organelles use the one on the right, which is a sodium-driven motor. Now, these motors are amazing because let's take a sperm cell. It has to swim through the medium to go and find an ovum, and sometimes it finds an obstacle and it has to increase the power and the torque to get over the obstacles. It goes over it and bumps into something and has to put it into reverse gear and try another route. It's got a forward gear, it's got a backward gear, it's got an increased torque. It's better than the Jeep that I've just gotten at the airport to drive here. And it's irreducibly complex. In other words, it's either all there or it doesn't work. Let's call the left one a gasoline engine and the one on the right a diesel engine. And if you take the pistons out, they don't work. They're irreducibly complex. What about a chloroplast that is the basis of the food chain that supplies all of us and all the animals in the world with food? It is an irreducibly complex structure. And the result is that you put water and carbon dioxide and light into the process, and boom, what comes out the other side? Sucrose. That's amazing. Nobody has ever been done that. Who's ever stuck a stick into the ground and got maple syrup? And man, we would be wonderful if we could do that. Man, why don't we think of it, but shove a stick in the ground and get maple syrup? Should be possible. So my 10 questions. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them. Is it plausible or is it not? That is the question. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, science does not have all the answers. Your book supplies many answers that are in contradiction with science. And the God that is described in that Bible is described as a God of love, and yet the world teaches that you are a tyrant. What a dichotomy of thought. Help us to cut through the noise to find the God that is a God of love, that was prepared to give up heaven, to die to redeem sinners such as us. Help us to find him, is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Veith. Just to remind you folks that we are going to continue our Creation Summit tomorrow morning. It's at 10 o'clock. Pastor Doug will be sharing a caveman's view of evolution. So that's going to be at 10 o'clock. Just looking at the group that's here in person this evening, if you don't come early, you might end up in overflow tomorrow morning, all right? So bear that in mind. If you can carpool with other family members, parking is going to be very much in need tomorrow. So if you can come as a family or bring the same car, that will be helpful. God bless. We'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. and God bless to those who are watching. We'll see you then.